Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling saw when he looked at Hannah Clarke during morning rounds at Mercy General. A quiet woman in pressed blue scrubs, eyes respectfully downcast, moving between patient beds with a kind of invisible efficiency that made her blend into the antiseptic-scented hallway like morning fog. He didn't see the surgical scars mapping her knuckles in pale white lines. He didn't see how she assessed trauma patients in 3 seconds flat, her gaze cataloging vital signs and pain responses before most doctors finished reading the chart. He didn't see the legend. Not yet. The ICU hummed its mechanical rhythm, ventilators wheezed their steady percussion, monitors beeped their monotonous surveillance, for pumps clicked and dispensed medicine in measured drips. Hannah moved through this symphony of machines with the precision of someone who'd worked in far worse conditions. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a clinical pallor, erasing shadows and softening the hard edges of metal railings and equipment carts. She'd been at Mercy General for 3 years, 14 hours a week during the shifts no one else wanted, accumulating a nursing record so spotless it was practically invisible. Her first stop was room for 12. Commander Hayes, a Marine recovering from abdominal surgery, lay propped at 45 degrees, his surgical site wrapped tight beneath a sterile dressing. He was 3 days post-op from an emergency repair of a perforated ulcer, the kind of crisis that moved fast if you weren't watching. Hannah pulled on fresh gloves, the snap of latex echoing softly in the quiet room, and began her assessment with movements that came from muscle memory honed across 12 years in places that couldn't be named on official paperwork. "How's the pain?" she asked, already reading his face before he could answer. "Manageable. 6 out of 10. Commander Hayes shifted slightly, testing his body's tolerance. She saw him wince at the movement, caught the micro-expression of a man trained to endure, to minimize, to press forward. Hannah adjusted his fore with hands that had held together far worse than abdominal wounds. In Marja, in the forward operating base, she'd run triage under fire with nothing but a field aid bag and the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Those hands had sutured vessels while explosions shook the concrete walls. Those hands had applied direct pressure to wounds that statistics said shouldn't have lived. Those hands had earned her the Navy Cross at the age of 28, along with the explicit order to disappear entirely from the record. "Let me reposition you," she said quietly. "Pneumonia's the risk at this stage. We'll prevent it." She worked through the repositioning with efficient movements, propping his left side slightly higher, adjusting the pillow to support proper lung expansion. Commander Hayes watched her hands move with the kind of attention a military man gives to someone who knows what they're doing. "You learned this in combat," he said. "Not a question." Hannah's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. A pause so brief most people would have missed it. She resumed her charting without looking up. "Good nursing is good nursing, sir." Commander Hayes smiled slightly. He'd served with enough field medics to recognize the movement patterns, the economy of motion, the way she assessed his breathing before she even placed the stethoscope to his chest. In Sanjin Valley, in Helmand Province, his whole squad had been pinned down by IED blast fragmentation. A combat medic had sutured his leg wound with hands that moved exactly like hers, precise, unhurried, the kind of sutures that held even when you had to move fast. The muscle memory of survival. Dr. Sterling arrived for afternoon rounds at 2:13 p.m., his white coat freshly pressed, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from old money and a last name that opened doors. He swept into the ICU corridor like someone who owned the air he moved through, his resident trailing behind with a tablet of patient files, nurses straightening slightly as he passed. Sterling was 46, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and eyes that looked at people the way a lion looks at antelope, calculating, dismissive, efficient predators measuring for weaknesses. He'd heard things about this quiet nurse over the 3 years she'd been at Mercy General. Nothing concrete. No complaints, no incidents, nothing that would stick to a personnel file. But he'd noticed how the other nurses deferred to her instinctively. How senior nurses asked her questions quietly, as if she carried knowledge they needed. How surgeons seemed calmer after she'd prepped a patient. It was a pattern that bothered him. Patterns like that suggested someone was operating outside their lane. Room for 12. Sterling entered first, his presence reshaping the air pressure in the small space the way a stone changes the current in a river. Commander Hayes straightened in bed, military instinct recognizing rank and authority even in a hospital gown. "Commander, how are we feeling today?" Sterling's voice had the smooth confidence of a man who expected answers to arrange themselves in his favor. "Pain's controlled. Mobility's improving," Hayes reported. Sterling nodded, barely looking at his patient. He was watching Hannah. She was rechecking the foresight, assessing the surrounding tissue for signs of infiltration, her movements so economical they barely seemed to move at all. When she made a small adjustment to the dressing, tucking the tape more securely, Sterling felt something sharp behind his ribs. She wasn't asking permission. She was simply acting, deciding, moving in the space he occupied. His space. "I'd suggest repositioning every 2 hours," Hannah said to Sterling, her voice low and deferential. "Pneumonia prophylaxis. He's at risk with the abdominal trauma limiting his breathing depth." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Interesting that you think clinical decisions are your domain, Nurse Clarke." The ICU went quiet. The hum of machines continued, beep, wheeze, click, drip, but something in the human frequency of the room had shifted. The resident lowered the tablet slightly. A nurse 3 beds down paused mid-adjustment of an 4 pump. Hannah met Sterling's gaze with one measured breath, let the silence exist between them for a count of 3, then returned to her charting without a word. Her composure was perfect. That was the problem. Sterling expected nurses to react when challenged. To defend themselves, or worse, to crumble. He expected deference to include a certain vulnerability, a tremor of fear at the possibility of confrontation. Hannah Clarke showed him neither. She simply continued her work, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her face a study in calm professionalism. The absence of any reaction was itself a reaction, and Sterling felt it like a mirror reflecting back something he didn't want to see about himself. Commander Hayes watched this exchange with the eyes of a man who'd sized up officers under fire. He'd seen the slight contraction of Sterling's pupils, the rigidity in his shoulders. He'd seen Hannah's absolute stillness, which looked like acquiescence but felt like something else entirely. Something unshakable. He said nothing, but his respect for the quiet nurse shifted categories. Sterling turned to his resident. "Make a note. We'll monitor that site closely. I don't want any independent adjustments made without approval." He shot a look at Hannah that was meant to land like a threat. "Clear." "Of course, Doctor," Hannah said, and there was something in the even cadence of those words that made Sterling's chest tighten with a rage he couldn't quite justify. When Sterling's entourage moved on to the next room, the ICU resumed its mechanical breathing. Hannah finished her charting and moved toward the staff break room to document the rounds on the central system. The morning fluorescent light had given way to afternoon gold angling through the windows at the end of the corridor. She was tired. 3 12-hour shifts in 6 days left her moving on routine and discipline, her body running on the kind of autopilot that came from military training and nothing else. During her break, Hannah opened her locker on the 3rd floor. The space was small, barely large enough for her personal items, a lunch bag, an extra pair of scrubs, a jacket for the drive home. And at the very bottom, hidden beneath everything else, a pair of boots. They were old. The leather was scuffed and worn to a soft grey in places, darker in the creases where they'd been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The laces had been replaced twice, the sole worn to an almost transparent thinness at the heel. A small brass nameplate was still visible on the inside of the right boot, barely readable, Clarke, H. She ran her thumb across the nameplate for exactly 2 seconds, then closed the locker door firmly. The boots had never been broken, not really. They'd been carried in her hands for 1,000 miles of transit. They'd been buried in a duffel bag in a basement in Virginia for 4 years. They'd been forbidden. The Pentagon's order had been explicit, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke no longer existed. The records were sealed. The photographs deleted. The decorations locked in a vault at Naval Special Warfare Command. The woman herself was just a nurse now, quiet enough to disappear into any hospital hallway in America. Nobody was supposed to remember. But Dr. Sterling had heard something in Commander Hayes's tone when he mentioned a combat medic in Marja. That note of recognition, of respect, of a man talking about someone who had saved his life. Sterling's mind had started moving then, making connections between the gaps in Hannah's employment history, years unaccounted for, dates that didn't align with civilian nursing experience. A nurse who moved like she'd trained for combat. Hands that bore the scars of surgery performed under conditions that had nothing to do with sterile operating rooms. And now, as Sterling stood in the physician's lounge 15 minutes later, he made a decision. He pulled up Hannah Clarke's personnel file on the hospital network, scrolling through her application, her references, her thin work history. 3 years here. Before that, nothing. A gap of 12 years that had been filled in with vague language about private nursing and independent contracting that satisfied nobody with a functioning curiosity. Something was wrong about this woman. Something hidden. And Dr. Sterling had built his entire career on finding the weak points in other people's stories and pressing until they broke. The next words he spoke were to his resident, who had followed him into the lounge. Find out everything about Nurse Clarke. Call the references from her application. Cross-check her education history. I want to know where she was for those missing years. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the authority of the hospital's hierarchy, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had never been refused. What Sterling didn't know was that the woman he was investigating had spent those missing years in places that didn't appear on any civilian map. That she'd earned her medical expertise not in nursing school but under fire, in forward operating bases and field hospitals where the difference between competence and incompetence was measured in lives saved or lost. That the Navy Cross in her sealed file represented 12 documented instances where she'd made decisions that violated protocol and created miracles anyway. He didn't know, and he had no way of knowing, because Hannah Clarke's records had been classified at the highest levels of the Pentagon. But his curiosity had been triggered, and that was the moment the quiet nurse became a problem that demanded solving. The ICU hummed on. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical buzzing. And Hannah Clarke, in her small locker on the 3rd floor of Mercy General Hospital, kept her worn combat boots hidden away beneath everything else, waiting for the day when staying invisible would no longer be possible. The morning rounds began like any other morning at Mercy General. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of Commander Hayes's room, his white coat pristine, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had built his entire career on hierarchy and control. Behind him trailed 3 residents, fresh-faced and eager, their notepads ready. Hannah Clarke was checking the surgical drain, her movements precise and economical, when Sterling entered. She didn't look up. She already knew what was coming. Nurse Clarke, Sterling said, his tone clipped and didactic. Would you explain to my team why you're using a suturing technique that was outdated 15 years ago? Hannah's hand stilled over the drain. The monitor beside the bed beeped its steady rhythm, beep, 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 a sound like a countdown to something neither of them could yet name. She straightened slowly, her fingers releasing the tubing with deliberate care. The interrupted sutures allow better drainage and reduce infection risk in post-operative, she began, her voice level. Sterling cut her off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile like a knife sliding between ribs. Our little Florence Nightingale here thinks she knows better than current evidence-based protocols. He turned to his residents as if Hannah wasn't standing 3 feet away. This is what happens when nurses confuse following orders with clinical judgment. Tell me, Ms. Clarke, where exactly did you complete your surgical training? Commander Hayes shifted uncomfortably in the bed, his jaw tightening. His wife sat in the chair by the window, their 2 teenage daughters flanking her like sentinels, their eyes wide and uncertain. Hannah took one measured breath. Just one. In that breath, she made a choice, the same choice she had made every day for the past 3 years. She would absorb this. She would not flinch. She would not break. She would answer with the calm of someone who had seen far worse than a surgeon's contempt. A single tear escaped down her cheek. Not from sadness. Not from humiliation. From the sheer weight of staying invisible while someone tried to make her small. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as surgical steel. Experience doesn't require an audience to validate it, she said quietly. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone overhead. Sterling's smile hardened into something uglier, frustration bleeding through because she hadn't broken, hadn't crumbled, hadn't given him the satisfaction of seeing her cracked. His residents exchanged uncertain glances. Commander Hayes leaned forward in his hospital bed, his eyes locked on Hannah's face with sudden, fierce recognition. Experience. Sterling's voice dropped, his words emerging like ice water. You're a floor nurse, dear. Let's not confuse following orders with clinical expertise. His residents laughed on cue, nervous sounds that filled the space where Hannah's dignity should have been. But it wasn't. It was still there, untouched. Still intact. Sterling saw that and hated her for it. Hannah finished her checks in silence and left the room. Behind her, Commander Hayes was asking questions she didn't stay to hear answered. She moved through the corridor toward the medication room, her stride unchanged, her posture unchanged, everything about her precisely calibrated to show nothing. The staff she passed averted their eyes, not from respect, but because Sterling had already begun his real work. Over the next 2 days, something shifted in the air at Mercy General. It was subtle at first. A nurse who had waved to Hannah in the break room on Tuesday nodded instead on Wednesday. The pharmacist who had once joked with her during medication reconciliation now processed her requests with clinical efficiency and nothing more. The attending from trauma surgery, who had praised her assessment skills during a critical patient transfer, started looking past her in the hallway as if she were furniture. By Thursday afternoon, Hannah entered the break room with her lunch, a sandwich wrapped in foil, a bottle of water, a small container of fruit she'd cut that morning at 5 o'clock when the apartment was still dark. 5 nurses sat around the vinyl table, their conversation animated and easy. The moment Hannah's badge clattered against the doorframe, they fell silent. One by one, they gathered their things. Chairs scraped against linoleum. Within 30 seconds, she was alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent buzz of the lights. Hannah sat down anyway. She unwrapped her sandwich. She took a bite. She chewed. Her hands did not shake. Her heart rate remained steady. She had trained for this, not this specific scenario, but the principle beneath it. The principle that sometimes survival meant continuing forward while everyone else was running backward. That same afternoon, she discovered the write-up. It was posted on the unit bulletin board where announcements about staffing shortages and new protocols usually lived. Formal letterhead. Dr. Sterling's signature in dark blue ink. RN Hannah Clarke, incident report, scope of practice violation. Observed overstepping nursing scope of practice. Patient assessment and clinical decision-making beyond RN licensure authority. Unauthorized medication administration timing and protocol deviation. Recommend immediate counseling and probationary status pending compliance review. Dr. James Sterling, MD. Mercy General Hospital Department of Surgery. Hannah read it once. Then again. Her face remained expressionless, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that emotions were tools, and right now they were the wrong tool for the job. She photographed the bulletin with her phone, committed it to memory, and walked toward the stairwell. The stairwell was empty. For flights up, for flights down, the concrete walls and metal railings creating a space where sound moved differently. She descended 2 flights, sat on a step, and allowed herself 3 slow breaths. 3. Not more. Not less. Just 3. In those 3 breaths, she thought about the boots in her locker. She thought about the 18-year-old girl in Marja who had learned to tie off a femoral artery while shells whistled overhead. She thought about the woman she had pretended to be for 3 years, the quiet nurse with no history, no credentials that mattered, no truth that was allowed to surface. Then she stood. She descended the remaining 2 flights. She returned to the unit. She clocked back in. She went to her next patient's room and did her job the way she had always done it, perfectly, precisely, with the kind of clinical care that was indistinguishable from love. That evening, Commander Hayes stopped her outside the supply closet. His surgical wound was healing cleanly. She had made sure of that with every dressing change, every assessment, every decision made not from a manual but from muscle memory that went back more than a decade. "That suturing technique," he said quietly. His voice carried the particular cadence of a Marine who had given orders and expected to be obeyed. "I've seen it before. Marja, 2010. A combat medic saved my platoon sergeant with those exact stitches. Those interrupted patterns, that angle of entry and exit. I watched her hands move. I never forgot them." Hannah's body temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. She could feel her blood pressure shifting, her pupils dilating, physical responses she couldn't control, responses that were screaming what her voice would not. "I'm sure many medics use similar techniques, Commander," she said, her voice level as still water. "No," he said. His eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of someone who recognized a legend when he finally stood in front of one. "They don't." She walked away before he could say another word. She didn't run. She didn't let her pace quicken. She moved through Mercy General's corridors like a woman without ghosts, like a woman who wasn't being hunted by her own past, like someone who had made the choice to disappear and had somehow believed it would work forever. But something had shifted. Commander Hayes had seen her. And there was no going back from being seen. The South Platte River didn't ask permission. At 11:47 p.m., it breached the containment barrier north of Denver with the kind of indifference that turns hospitals into war zones, and by midnight the basement level of Mercy General was drowning. Water surged through the radiology department first, then the storage corridors, then began its slow, inexorable climb toward the first floor. The backup generators kicked in with a diesel shudder that rattled through every wall. Alarms screamed on 3 separate floors simultaneously. This wasn't a drill. This was what happened when nature decided to test your infrastructure and your people in the same 12-hour window. Hannah was finishing a double shift she hadn't planned on when the emergency notification started flooding through the hospital net. The ICU needed evacuation. The lower level was flooding. All available staff to patient safety protocols. She'd been standing in the break room drinking cold coffee, not because she liked cold coffee but because she'd forgotten to drink it hot, when the code started rolling. By the time she reached the 4th floor ICU, she'd already mentally sorted the patients, stable enough to move versus critical versus barely holding. Her hands were moving before her brain finished catching up, muscle memory from years of triage kicking in like it had never left her body. Maybe it never had. The evacuation was chaos orchestrated with clinical precision. Hannah worked the East Corridor, moving ventilated patients in coordinated pushes with respiratory therapy. The ICU nurses were good, competent and fast, but they kept glancing at her. She'd notice it later, in the aftermath, that they'd instinctively deferred to her during the crisis. Not because she pulled rank. She hadn't. But because something in the way she moved, the way she assessed each patient without panic, the way she made decisions in real time with incomplete information, it made them follow. Her voice didn't rise. Her movements didn't quicken. She was calm the way a fighter is calm in the ring, not because nothing was wrong, but because adrenaline was information and information was power. The stairwell on the east side was 2 flights down from ICU to the main floor, and that's where it happened. She was guiding a gurney carrying Commander Hayes, 6 days post-op, his incision healing cleanly, vitals stable until they weren't, when his entire body went rigid. His hand flew to his chest. His mouth opened but no sound came out except a strangled gasp that sounded like air being pulled through a blocked tube. Hannah's eyes moved to the portable monitor clipped to the gurney frame. Oxygen saturation 71 and falling. Heart rate 148. Blood pressure already climbing as his body fought for air it couldn't reach. She knew. She'd seen it before. She'd fixed it before. The clinical signs aligned with terrible precision, his left chest hyper-expanded, the trachea deviating right like it was running from something, his jugular veins distending so visibly they looked like they might split the skin. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, pressure building with every breath, collapsing the left lung and pushing everything else toward the right side of his chest cavity. Classic. Textbook. Fatal if untreated in the next 90 seconds. She keyed the radio with her left hand while continuing to push the gurney with her right. Rapid response team, stairwell east, 4th floor landing. Pneumothorax, decompensating. Need physician now. The radio crackled back immediately, but the voices were layered chaos. All teams are deployed to flood mitigation, multiple codes running. Sterling's voice cut through the static like a blade. All non-essential staff clear the stairwells immediately. Physicians only for critical interventions. Those are orders. Hannah didn't respond. She was already moving. The emergency kit was mounted on the crash cart 2 landings up. She'd passed it 30 seconds earlier. She took the stairs without breaking stride, grabbed the kit, and was back beside the gurney in under a minute. Commander Hayes's wife stood frozen at the railing, her hands shaking. The evacuation staff had paused, uncertain. Hannah's movements became more focused, more precise. This was the part where hesitation cost lives. She opened the emergency kit one-handed, pulled out a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind designed for high-flow resuscitation but perfectly calibrated for what she needed. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical point she'd learned in a combat medicine course 14 years ago in a desert compound that no longer existed. One alcohol prep swipe. Gloved fingers palpating the landmarks. The needle perpendicular to the chest wall. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of pressure releasing, of a body remembering how to breathe. Like opening a pressure cooker. Like the moment a fist unclenches. Commander Hayes gasped, his whole body convulsing, his color returning from the ashen blue-gray of hypoxia back toward something resembling human. His eyes focused. His oxygen saturation climbed, 75, 82, 88. She secured the catheter with tape she'd kept in her pocket. Who kept medical tape in their pocket? Her mind noted distantly, and checked his vitals again. The monitor showed a heartbeat no longer frantic. Breathing audible and deepening. Sinus rhythm finding its way back home. That's when Sterling appeared on the landing above, and the world went dead silent except for his voice. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His face had gone the color of raw meat. His hands were clenched so hard his knuckles looked like they might split through the skin. "You just performed a surgical procedure. You performed it without a physician present. You violated every protocol in the emergency medicine handbook. You're finished, Clarke. Finished." Hannah didn't look up. She was checking the catheter placement one final time, her fingers steady as surgical steel. Commander Hayes's wife had her hand over her mouth. The evacuation staff stood frozen. The hospital continued falling apart around them, water rising, alarms screaming, chaos metastasizing through the stairwell, but in that small circle of fluorescent light on a landing between floors, time had compressed into something sharp and singular. Hannah straightened and looked at Sterling directly. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than a man with authority and nowhere to put it. He would have died in 3 minutes. You were 2 floors away. She turned back to Commander Hayes. We need to get you to a physician who can evaluate the pneumothorax on imaging and determine if intervention beyond this is necessary. But you're breathing now. That's what matters. Sterling was already on his phone, the gesture so automatic it looked like muscle memory. She heard him through the stairwell echo. "This is Dr. Sterling. I need to speak to the board president. I don't care what time it is. I have a situation that requires immediate documentation." His voice climbed 2 octaves as he explained. His face grew darker. She could see the calculation happening in his eyes. Hannah had just saved a life in full view of witnesses. She'd done it competently. She'd done it without hesitation. And that meant she'd just made him look incompetent for not being there to do it himself. The evacuation continued. Hannah moved with the grace of someone who'd made peace with the consequences of her choices long ago. She helped get Commander Hayes down to the 1st floor, where an actual physician, a trauma surgeon named Reeves who'd been coordinating the flood evacuation, took one look at the catheter placement and said, "This is perfect work." "Who did this?" Hannah didn't answer. Reeves didn't ask twice. He was already on his radio calling for a chest tube setup, already reading the decompression like it was written in a language only competent trauma surgeons could speak. The rest of the night dissolved into coordinated chaos. The flood receded. The generators held. The patients Hannah had evacuated made it to safety. By 4 in the morning, the hospital was stable enough that the real assessment could begin. Damage estimates. Water damage. Equipment loss. But also this, Hannah Clarke, in full view of nursing staff and families and a trauma surgeon, had performed emergency medicine that saved a man's life while a physician screamed that she had no right. The question was no longer whether she'd hidden her past. The question was whether anyone could miss what she actually was, now that they'd finally seen it. Sterling paced the administrative corridor at 5 a.m., his phone still in his hand, his mind already 3 moves ahead. She'd done this on purpose. She'd set him up. She'd let that patient deteriorate so she could play hero. Nobody would believe him, though. Not anymore. Not after what they'd seen. He'd have to be smarter. He'd have to move faster. He'd have to make sure that before anyone had time to ask questions about how a nurse knew combat medicine, they were already asking questions about her background, her references, her employment history, her security clearance. He made 3 phone calls before sunrise. To the board president. To a compliance investigator he knew from a previous hospital network. To Hannah's personnel file. By the time the sun came up over Denver, the machinery that would destroy her career was already in motion. Hannah didn't know any of this yet. She was drying off in the locker room, her scrubs replaced with street clothes, her shift officially over. The combat boots in the bottom of her locker caught the fluorescent light for just a moment. She closed the door on them. She'd made a choice in that stairwell. She'd chosen to save a life instead of protect her cover. She'd chosen the mission over the disguise. And now everything was about to change. By morning, the floodwaters had receded enough for Mercy General to count its losses. The South Platte River left behind a trail of destruction in the basement, equipment destroyed, files waterlogged, the entire lower level a monument to the previous night's chaos. Hannah had worked through the evacuation, moving patients up 6 flights of stairs, her hand steady even as Sterling screamed accusations from the stairwell. She'd chosen the mission over the disguise. And now the bill was coming due. She reported for her shift at 7 in the morning. Tom, the security guard who always smiled at her in the break room, met her at the entrance instead. His face looked like he hadn't slept. The morning air was cold, carrying the smell of wet drywall and diesel exhaust from the emergency generators still running. "Ms. Clarke." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I need your badge." Hannah didn't ask why. She already knew. She unclipped the laminated ID from her scrub pocket. 3 years of shifts, 847 patients, countless quiet saves accumulated in a single piece of plastic. She placed it in Tom's palm without hesitation. Her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk. "Commander Hayes is alive because of what I did." Tom nodded. His hands trembled slightly as he held the badge. "I know, but I have my orders." She walked back to her car. The rain had stopped, but the parking lot still glistened, reflecting the pale morning sky. She sat behind the wheel for 2 minutes without starting the engine, watching other nurses arrive for their shifts, watching them scan their badges and disappear into the building. Her badge was already gone. Her access was already erased. By the time the sun finished climbing above the hospital's roof, Hannah Clarke was no longer an employee of Mercy General. Inside, Dr. Sterling was already building his case with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. He'd called Janet Morrison, the outside compliance investigator, at 6 in the morning, before the hospital board could wake up and ask questions. They sat in the 4th-floor conference room, the space still smelling of coffee and laser printer ink. Sterling laid out his evidence with the voice of a man who'd rehearsed every word. She performed a needle decompression without physician oversight, violated her suspension by continuing to work, and demonstrated a pattern of exceeding her nursing scope of practice. I'm recommending immediate termination and a board of nursing investigation. Morrison reviewed the file. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the exhausted expression of someone who'd seen too many workplace conflicts. Her pen moved across the margins, making notes. The military-style precision in her work. The unexplained employment gaps. These trauma techniques are combat level. She looked up at Sterling. We may be dealing with falsified credentials, Doctor. Credentials fraud. That's a federal matter. Sterling's smile was the smile of a man who'd just found exactly what he wanted. I was hoping you'd see it that way. Within 48 hours, Sterling had filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Board of Nursing. He drafted the termination letter himself, his signature elegant and certain at the bottom of the page. He attached the compliance report. He copied the hospital's legal department. He even reached out to Hannah's previous employers, a clinic in Portland, a rural health center in Wyoming, asking pointed questions about gaps in her employment history, about why there were no references from her military service, about whether she'd ever mentioned classified work. The message was clear: I'm burying you. 3 days later, Hannah sat in the waiting room of the Denver VA hospital with an intake form on her lap that requested anxiety medication. Around her, the sound of fluorescent lights hummed like distant sirens. A Marine with a prosthetic leg sat to her left, reading a 3-month-old magazine. An Army specialist with a service dog leaned against the wall. A sailor with trembling hands that matched hers stared at the floor. Hannah recognized the look in their eyes because she used to see it in her own mirror during her second combat tour in Marja, after the operation that nobody spoke about anymore. She'd come to the VA because she couldn't afford her own psychiatrist, and because the medical records here were separate from civilian hospitals. Invisible. The intake coordinator, a young woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders, had asked the standard questions: sleep disturbance? Yes. Hypervigilance? Yes. Intrusive thoughts? Daily. The psychiatrist prescribed 50 milligrams of sertraline once daily and told her to call if things got worse. As if things could get worse. A young Army medic across the waiting room mentioned Marja to someone on his phone. Something about route clearance operations. About finding IEDs in the Sanjin Valley. Hannah's hand shook so badly she dropped her intake pen. It clattered on the linoleum floor, a sharp sound that made her flinch. The medic retrieved it, handed it back to her, and as their hands almost touched, he looked at her hands. He saw the surgical scars. He saw the tremor. He saw something flicker behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it, and Hannah looked away before he could ask. She drove home in silence. The prescription was in her pocket. 3 years at Mercy General. Gone. Her security badge confiscated by a man who'd watched her save a patient's life and decided that saving lives was overstepping. Sterling had erased her so completely that she wondered if she'd ever really existed at all, or if she'd just been a ghost walking through those corridors, invisible until the moment Sterling decided to make her disappear permanently. That night, alone in her apartment, Hannah sat on the edge of her bed and opened the wooden box for the first time in 18 months. She didn't mean to. Muscle memory was a powerful thing. Muscle memory told her hands to reach for the bottom of her closet. Muscle memory told her where the box was hidden. She stared at the contents without touching them, the medals wrapped in faded silk, the commendation letters, the photographs from deployments, the challenge coin from SEAL Team 3. Evidence of a life that the military had ordered her to bury. Evidence of a person she was supposed to forget being. She closed the box and put it back. Then her son Marcus came home. He burst through the apartment door with the force of someone who'd made a decision and decided to live with the consequences. He was 16, with her eyes and her father's jawline, and he was carrying something wrapped in an old army blanket. "Mom," he said, breathless, "they need to see these." Hannah understood what the blanket contained before he unwrapped it. The color drained from her face. Marcus, no. We talked about this. That box stays closed. You got fired for saving someone. His voice had the steel in it that she recognized, the same steel she'd learned to use in Marja. The same tone she'd used when interrogating insurgents about IED locations. They fired you for doing your job, and nobody knows why. They're saying you overstepped. They're trying to destroy you. But you're not just a nurse, are you? Marcus. I'm taking this to the hospital. He was already moving toward the door. Hannah reached for him, but he'd always been fast. She was trained in combat medicine, in surgical procedures under fire, in keeping soldiers alive in the worst conditions imaginable. She was not trained in stopping her 16-year-old son from making the decision she'd been too afraid to make herself. 40 minutes later, Marcus stood in the Mercy General lobby with the wooden box open on the reception desk. Security was already moving toward him. His voice was young but carried authority he shouldn't have had to learn. I need to speak to the hospital board. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. The word spread through the hospital like electricity through copper wire. Nurse Carla from Hannah's unit heard it from a resident who heard it from a visitor. She appeared at the reception desk, her hands trembling as she looked at the medals. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Navy Cross. Things that didn't belong in a hospital. Things that belonged in classified files and sealed records and the kind of silence that the Pentagon enforces with federal law. This is a Bronze Star with V device, Carla whispered, lifting it with the reverence of someone handling holy relics. For Valor in combat. 37 surgical saves. 2 combat tours. Marja District, 2010. Marine Special Operations Team 8231. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was what happened next. Marcus burst through the apartment door like a storm, breathless and wild-eyed, carrying the wooden box Hannah had forbidden him to touch since he was 7 years old. She was in the kitchen, folding scrubs into a cardboard box labeled personal items, her movements mechanical, empty. The box he held had her entire life carved into its wood grain, medals, insignia, memories she'd spent 8 years trying to bury. Mom, they need to see these. His voice cracked with teenage fury. They fired you for saving someone. They fired you for being a hero. Hannah's hand stilled. Marcus, put that back. He opened it anyway. The Navy Cross lay on faded velvet, the ribbon crimson and white, heavier than any object that size should be. Below it, a silver star. Then a bronze star with the V device for Valor. Each one a moment she'd promised herself she'd never excavate. 8 years of anonymity, erased by her 16-year-old son's fury. No. Hannah reached for the box. You don't understand the rules. You don't understand. I understand you saved lives. Marcus gripped the box tighter. I understand Dr. Sterling broke you for it, and everyone let him. I'm not letting him anymore. Before she could stop him, before she could explain the federal protocols and classified operations orders that made these medals weapons in the wrong hands, Marcus was out the door and down the stairs. Hannah followed, her breath ragged, her composure fracturing for the first time since the suspension. By the time she reached the parking lot, he was already driving. The lobby of Mercy General at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday was a collision of fluorescent light and muted panic. Staff moved through their rotations like ghosts, careful not to acknowledge Hannah Clarke's name anymore. That was where Marcus burst through the automatic doors, the wooden box clutched against his chest like a declaration of war. I need to speak to the hospital board. His voice echoed across the tile. Now. All of them. Security moved toward him. A charge nurse Hannah recognized, Jennifer from ICU, who'd stopped speaking to her 3 days into the suspension, stepped forward with administrative caution. Sir, the board meets on Thursdays. If you'd like to schedule. Marcus opened the box. The lobby went dead silent. The Navy Cross gleamed under the fluorescence like a captured star. The silver star caught the light. The Bronze Star with V device lay beside them, each ribbon testimony to operations that lived in classified files and sealed records. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Marcus's voice was quiet now, which made it more devastating. She's the nurse you fired 2 days ago. For doing her job. For saving a patient's life during the flood. And you fired her because one man was terrified of her. A board member appeared from the administrative corridor, Dr. Chen, the chief medical officer, her face cycling through shock and something that looked like dawning comprehension. Behind her came 3 others, the board president, the HR director, and Morrison, the compliance investigator, her expression unreadable. Where did you get those? Morrison's voice was steady but thin. Public record now, Marcus said, pulling folded papers from his pocket. FOIA request filed by a lawyer. 2 combat tours. 37 surgical saves under fire. Decorated for valor. And you suspended her because she used field techniques to save someone's life in a flood. That's when they walked through the doors, the same ones that had released their flood water 3 days prior. Commander Hayes, moving carefully but moving, his shoulder no longer bound, his eyes seeking the nearest face and finding none of them. Behind him came a nurse from Hannah's unit, one of the few who'd spoken to her after the write-up. Sarah. Sarah had worked with Hannah in field hospitals in Marja. Sarah knew exactly what those medals meant. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the file Marcus extended. Her voice broke as she read. 2 tours in Helmand Province. Silver Star for actions in Sanjan Valley. Bronze Star for surgical intervention under active fire. Navy Cross 4. She couldn't finish. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked directly at the board members. She saved my life in that valley. She saved 23 Marines that year alone. You fired her for using the techniques that kept us breathing. Commander Hayes stepped forward, every inch of him military bearing despite the recent surgery. The Navy Cross recognizes extraordinary heroism in combat. His voice was a command, not a statement. That's what Senior Chief Clarke earned. The Silver Star recognizes gallantry in action. That's her service record. And the Bronze Star with V device, that's valor. That's the woman you just terminated because she performed an emergency needle decompression on me during a crisis, using techniques she learned saving lives in places you'll never see on a map. The lobby had filled with staff. Nurses stopped their charts. Orderlies paused mid-stride. Everyone was staring at the medals, at Marcus, at Sarah's tears, at Commander Hayes standing upright on a shoulder that Hannah Clarke had saved. Dr. Sterling wasn't there. He was in a conference room on the 3rd floor, waiting for Morrison to call him about the termination proceedings. He had no idea his world was collapsing in the lobby like a building imploding. The sound of the doors opening again broke the tableau. 2 men in dark suits entered, their movements synchronized and precise. Federal agents had a way of making air pressure change, of making hospital tiles feel like testimony grounds. Dr. Kenneth Sterling, one of them said, and it wasn't a question. FBI Special Agents Torres and Reeves. We need to speak with Dr. Sterling and the hospital administration simultaneously. We have a federal matter that requires immediate attention. Dr. Chen's eyes closed briefly. She already knew. They found Sterling in the 3rd floor conference room with Morrison and 3 board members. He was mid-sentence, describing Hannah's professional gaps and concerning employment history, when the FBI agents entered. The color didn't drain from Sterling's face gradually. It left like someone had pulled a plug. Dr. Sterling, Torres said, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who'd done this before, your inquiries into Senior Chief Clarke's military service have triggered multiple federal counterintelligence protocols. You contacted 14 federal agencies attempting to access classified records. You filed 3 separate FOIA requests for sealed combat operation details. You personally pressured 2 active-duty naval officers and 1 Defense Intelligence Agency analyst for information they're legally prohibited from disclosing. Sterling's hand reached for water that wasn't there. I was conducting due diligence. You were harassing a decorated service member whose records were classified under national security protocols. Reeves pulled a folder from his briefcase. Those protocols have just expired, which is the only reason we're having this conversation instead of you being escorted from this building by military police. Unauthorized access to classified military records violates the Espionage Act. Pressuring federal employees to disclose that information constitutes additional federal violations. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the static. You weaponized institutional authority to destroy a combat veteran because she threatened your ego, Dr. Sterling. The woman you publicly humiliated saved Commander Hayes' life during the flood. The very technique you mocked as outdated protocol is what kept him breathing in a stairwell while you were unreachable. Sterling's hand shook as he reached for words. I didn't know. I wasn't aware her records were. You should have been aware, Chen said quietly, and there was something infinitely worse in her calm than there would have been in anger. You should have asked. Instead, you conducted an investigation that violated federal law because you couldn't tolerate competence that didn't require your approval. Torres slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Resignation letter. Effective immediately. If you decline, we proceed with termination and full cooperation with federal investigation. Your choice, Dr. Sterling. You have 5 minutes. Sterling's signature on that paper was illegible, the hand that wrote it disconnected from consciousness. The pen clattered to the table. Nobody retrieved it. The news spread through Mercy General like oxygen. By 5 p.m., the break room nurses who'd abandoned Hannah in her isolation were whispering in corners, their shame visible in the way they couldn't meet each other's eyes. Morrison quietly closed her compliance file and left the building by the staff entrance, avoiding the lobby entirely. The compliance investigator didn't file her report. It was never needed. By evening, Commander Hayes had contacted Naval Special Warfare Command. A JAG officer was en route to Denver to discuss reinstatement of Hannah's records and restoration of her security clearance, now that her classified operations period had formally expired. The classified operations in Marja stayed classified, but the medals were hers to claim. The service was hers to acknowledge. The silence, finally, was hers to break. That same evening, Hannah's phone rang. Dr. Chen's voice was professional but warm. Senior Chief Clarke would like to speak with you tomorrow morning. Would 8 a.m. work? Hannah almost declined. Assumed it was legal proceedings, termination paperwork, the final administrative nail. But Marcus took the phone from her hands. She'll be there, he said. And Mom? You can't hide anymore. They know. They all know. That night, Hannah opened the wooden box for the first time in 8 years. Her fingertips traced the Navy cross, remembering the face of the Marine who'd bled out despite everything she did, the one she couldn't save. The silver star reminded her of the sound the OR made when you were racing against shock and blood loss and the finite container of human survival. The bronze star felt heavy with names. With operations that stayed sealed. With the cost of Valor being that nobody could ever know what it cost. She made a decision in the darkness of her apartment. Tomorrow, she stops disappearing. Hannah Clarke walked into Mercy General at 7:55 a.m. wearing her Navy service uniform for the first time in 8 years. The dress blues hung on her frame like a second skin, the ribbons precise against her chest, the insignia of Senior Chief Petty Officer visible on her collar. The lobby went silent. Not the heavy silence of shame, the charged silence of people finally seeing something they'd always overlooked. Dr. Chen met her personally, extending a hand with genuine respect. Senior Chief Clarke. We owe you an apology and considerably more than that. The reinstatement came with back pay. But Chen went further, her voice steady and clear. We're creating a Director of Emergency Medicine position. Your crisis leadership during the flood, your combat medical expertise, your decision-making under pressure, we need you in command, not just on the floor. The position includes administrative authority, a departmental budget, and the power to rebuild how we train and respond to emergencies. If you'll have us. Hannah accepted before she could overthink it. Before the old habit of invisibility could pull her back under. 2 days later, she stood in her new office on the 4th floor. The space smelled like fresh paint and possibility. She placed the worn combat boots on the shelf behind her desk, where they'd finally belong, no longer hidden in the darkness of a locker. They caught the afternoon light coming through the window. Evidence. Testimony. Home. Through that same window, she watched the staff parking lot. Tom, the security guard who'd escorted her out with her box of personal items, was walking alongside another familiar figure. Dr. Sterling. His face was hollow. His white coat was already folded over his arm. Tom handed him a cardboard box, the same type Hannah had received. "I believe you know the way out, sir," Tom said, and there was a weight in those words that turned Sterling's spine into a question mark. He took the box without responding and walked toward the exit with the gait of someone who'd lost gravity. The hospital grapevine carried the news within hours. Sterling had accepted a position teaching CPR at a community college across town. Minimum wage. No institutional power. No hierarchy to protect him. His medical license was under review by the State Medical Board for ethics violations. His board connections had severed the moment federal agents walked into that conference room. Commander Hayes visited Hannah's office that Friday, his shoulder healed, his strength returning. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the boots on the shelf, the woman sitting at the desk with command in her posture. "I never forgot those sutures, Senior Chief," he said quietly. "I knew someone that skilled couldn't just disappear. Not by choice." Hannah met his eyes. "I was ordered to disappear, Commander. Marja stayed classified until last month. The operations we were part of, those stay sealed. But the medals I earned doing that work? Those are finally mine to claim." He nodded understanding. "You saved my life twice. Once in a combat zone I'm never going to be allowed to discuss. And once in a stairwell during a flood, using techniques you learned when you were saving lives in places most people will never understand. Thank you, Senior Chief." After he left, Hannah sat alone in her office and allowed herself one quiet moment. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, a photo of her in uniform standing in the hospital lobby, already spreading through military circles with a caption, "Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark." Hannah smiled. A small, real smile. The kind that comes from knowing the silence is finally over. She returned to her work, her desk, her department. She has a crisis response protocol to rebuild. She has a team to train. She has lives to save. This time, in the light. If Hannah's quiet competence could be buried under institutional power until forced accountability, then yours might be too. Watch for the quiet ones in your workplace, the competent people being systematically undermined. They might be carrying secrets that change everything. Subscribe for more stories about how heroes walk among us, and let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone silenced by institutional power? What finally broke that silence?